It's a real challenge across design disciplines, not just architecture, but landscape, planning, etc. It was a really great conversation we had on Monday, and it came out of Architecture, Art, and Design magazine called Scala that was originally founded by Henning Larsen, who founded the practice that I work with. And it was meant to just create open dialogue. It was around for a few decades, and then for 30 years, there hasn't been an issue. We relaunched it with this issue 31, partly to mark also the 100th anniversary of his birth, but feeling that a lot of the issues that were brought up in it were still relevant. And the theme around it was polarities. And that talk was particularly around time and polarities of time, this kind of urgency and endurance, right? Architecture is a slow in many ways. It's in many ways also kind of anachronistic, right? It's been around for a long time. It takes time to do buildings, but particularly large projects, which I spend a lot of time on.
We've got a really exciting episode for you today with Gregory Haley, an architect who spent 14 years at Grimshaw helping build the Fulton Street Transit Center in Lower Manhattan. Now serves as an associate principal at Henning Larsen. He teaches at Penn, and he lives with one foot in architecture and another in urban design. His work spans from Copenhagen to Toronto to Africa, and he thinks the most powerful thing that a building can do is create a moment of joy that makes you pause in your day. Greg gets into how he designs at the scale of entire cities and the scale of a single column, why the best public spaces aren't the Instagrammable ones, and what it really takes to balance the fast-moving AI tools with slow generational thinking in architecture. Whether you're an architect, a designer, or just curious about how cities shape daily life, you're going to walk away with some practical ideas that creating spaces and places that truly connect with people. Let's get into it. Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening to another episode of Buildings 2.0, a podcast that highlights the voices shaping our built environment. Today, I have a special guest, Gregory Haley, Associate Principal of Henning Larsen, a global architecture and urban design studio known for blending human-centered design, environmental performance, civic identity across cultural, institutional, and urban spaces worldwide. Greg, thanks for joining.
Thanks, Jose. It's my pleasure. It's great to be with you this morning.
You recently posted an announcement for a panel discussion you curated. And in the post, you asked, in a world driven by instant feeds and rapid development, how do we hold a space for slow generational wisdom at the heart of architecture? You added that designers need to negotiate the tensions between the instant and the enduring. What are we missing?
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge across design disciplines, not just architecture, but landscape, planning, etc. It was a really great conversation we had on Monday, and it came out of a architecture, art, and design magazine called Scala that was originally founded by Henning Larsen, who founded the practice that I work with. And it was meant to just create open dialogue. It was around for a few decades, and then for 30 years, there hasn't been an issue. We relaunched it with this issue 31, partly to mark also the 100th anniversary of his birth, but feeling that a lot of the issues that were brought up in it were still relevant. And the theme around it was polarities. And that talk was particularly around time and polarities of time, this kind of urgency and endurance, right? Architecture is a slow in many ways. It's in many ways also kind of anachronistic, right? It's been around for a long time. It takes time to do buildings, but particularly large projects, which I spend a lot of time on. I kind of sit in a world with one foot sort of in architecture and one in urban design. And those take a certain amount of patience, but we also have so many urgent needs. And I think sustainability is sort of front and center there for us. And I think the conversation was a lot around how you leverage kind of incremental things and how you think across a portfolio, because there's research I think we all felt was really important, that there's something informing the work that we do so that we can create impact, right? Whether that's using AI or using digital tools or really understanding site and culture, having the right consultants, all of that sort of takes time. And so the more that we can build that by projects over time, that accumulates and creates a kind of toolbox and a nimbleness, right? That we can use lots of different tools depending on the time frame that we have and where we sit, right? And that the sort of perfect doesn't become the enemy of the good, as it were. And so I think it was a great conversation we had with Kim Yao of Architecture Research Office and Susanna Drake of formerly D-Land Studio Sasaki, who's now pursuing a PhD, as well as Jakob Kurek, who's our managing director with Henning Larsen, who brought a kind of global perspective. And I think for Henning Larsen, there's also a lot of ways that we try to leverage that kind of global experience and how that ties to local, because there's different relevance in different places. His one of his examples was, I think in Copenhagen, we're able to kind of make bigger kind of jumps in sustainability because of the market, the culture, the regulations, right? That can be sometimes more of a challenge in North America. But in North America, we also have a big push around inclusivity, around engagement and community that is not the same, and that is a focus on diversity that's not the same there. So they also learn lessons from here across there. So I think sometimes that time has to be thought about over a longer time frame.
You're one of the unique professionals in that your literal job is to be able to zoom out as far as the kind of urban scale, the scale of cities, and then zooming in as close as to like why this column should be next to like a certain distance from the next column. In your experience as both kind of urban scale designer as well as building scale designer, what unique things have you learned about kind of oscillating between the two scales that perhaps, someone just looking at the city or someone just looking at the building
Yeah.
may.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I mean, that goes right to, I think, to the heart of my interests, and why I also, I think, really appreciate working with Henning Larsen, is because I think it aligns with the way I see the relationship between, say, architecture and urbanism or landscape, which is that, well, let me back up a moment. I think that urban design or planning or longer term kind of thinking about our environment is a big table. It's and it requires a kind of village. It requires people from policy, from landscape, from planning, from architecture to be involved to really make a good urban environment. And I think, to me, urban design is something that is not so much a profession as a practice. And I can come to it as an architect. I can come to it as a landscape architect. I can come to it as a mayor, as a policy maker, right? And all of those inputs are kind of required. The way that we practice it, and that I like to see it, is that we practice architecture urbanistically and urbanism architecturally. And what that means to me, and what I've learned about working across those scales, is the importance that when I'm working at an urban scale, that it is not just an abstract idea or a one big move of a diagram. Sometimes big moves can help build consensus, but there has to be a nuance and a thinking about, what does that then eventually feel like on the ground? Does that actually create a place where people will congregate, where it does then have social impact because it's a place where people want to be? And that can relate to lots of things. That's about uses that go into it, but it's also about scale of architecture, scale of landscape. It's about microclimate. It's about how those things create a place that is comfortable, that I want to be there because I'm in the sun in the winter, right? Or I have some shade in the summer in a hot climate. That there are places for me to gather with a large group of people, but also a place where I can feel comfortable sitting by myself. And those are things that can get lost when things remain only at a very high level. On the other hand, buildings, I think, really need to think about, a building can make a big difference in how comfortable an environment feels and how it relates to buildings around it, that it's not an isolated object, but it really is contributing to a larger thing over time.
Right. Talk to me about that. So, when we speak about the word context in design is,
Mm.
is often overused, and depending
Yeah.
on who you ask, it could mean a slightly different thing.
Yeah.
If I envisioned a table of ingredients where
Yeah.
folks designed context by, say, like social impact or maybe tectonics and whatnot, what does that table look like for you? Like, what are the ingredients that you consider when approaching a project? Let's call it kind of an urban scale project. What are the ingredients? What are you considering?
Yeah. So there again, I think, are many things there. There is a kind of there's always, as an architect, there's always a little bit of the kind of the character and the feel of that place that has likely built over some amount of time. And how do you add to that? Not necessarily mimic it, but find a way to be in dialogue with it. So that's one thing on a kind of more physical, or, as you said, tectonic level, let's say, right? It also can relate to construction and material methods that have happened there because they're local, because they relate to ways of building there, right? We have work, particularly in far different kind of contexts, say from Copenhagen, out of our office there, working, say, in Africa, where we really picked up local materials and tectonics and ways of building that creates a whole new feel of architecture that relates to its context because it relates to the process of how things happen. But I think it's also important to just understand the culture and the way people use buildings and space there to respond to context as much as just beyond the physical, that social aspects. Because, and I think that's why it's important to us to always have local partners. And that can be local architects that work with us that are very familiar with the surroundings and can help us to learn it. It requires going there quite often because we do work across the globe. But also, all of our work, particularly in Canada, we also have Indigenous partners, often as consultants within our team, but we're also engaging, for example, on the Quayside project that we did in Toronto, engaging with a local, with a sponsor First Nation group that is working with us on developing urban design guidelines and on programming of the district so that it really resonates with local culture and local history. So I think there's a lot of that, which is response, but I also think context is not a static thing, right? It is something that we also should be thinking about how we help actively build. I liked in New York, you get such a diversity of buildings against each other and a jumble of things. But when I look at some buildings, I always love those moments where there's buildings that used to have this continuous cornice line that then maybe just end in nowhere, right? Because they were anticipating someone to continue on, someone to keep building, right? How can buildings and urban design also put forward a little bit of a prompt for someone else, right? What else could happen next? And I think that's really important, that there isn't a stasis, but there is a kind of opening of new possibilities.
In your experience, say from your early years as a designer to now your current role at Henning Larsen, have you had to unlearn things, say dating back 5, 10 years that perhaps you now believe?
That's a good question. Things that I would unlearn. I mean, I think we're always learning new things and learning kind of, it's a lot of like learning where to put your priorities, right? I think as a younger architect, certain things may seem more important than others that you focus so much time and you realize over time that maybe that's not as important, and maybe we focus on where we really put our effort and the detail into a building, for example, primarily, and even the budget and the money really much more towards the things that have the most impact, right? Which are often sort of at ground level, right? And that's maybe a little bit letting go or kind of prioritizing where you put your effort in an overall building, right? And based on its impact. I think there's also an unlearning for sure around or a decentering, let's say, around sustainability, which was only really well. I mean, my father is an architect, and he finished architecture school in the late '60s. There were so many things that was a really beginning, right, of thinking about sustainability. But then there was a moment where it really kind of went quiet for a while in the world of architecture. All right, and it was really reemerging when I was finishing our undergraduate and graduate school. But I think now it's so front and center. And it's so obvious also its connection with so many other crises that we have, social inequities and climate crises, et cetera, and the boom of cities and how that has focused, that I think has really changed. I think when I first finished undergraduate school studying urban design, I remember going to interviews and people being a little bit not sure quite what to do with me, thinking, well, are you an architect or are you a planner? And now I think cities are so front and center. So I think there's a shift there in focus and priority that I can really see, and thinking about materials in a very different way, because thinking about their embodied carbon, about how they were made, and whether that was a just kind of manufacturing process, things that were not as much of a focus when I first came out of school, which was much more about the kind of detailing and the material of it, which is still, I think, very close to my heart and important. But there's another layer on top of that, I think, that really needs to be considered that wasn't there so much, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. On that, to zoom back into the subject of cities, right before recording here, you mentioned the importance of public spaces. You and I are both in New York, right? We both move around in the subway, but I think perhaps as kind of a third person looking in, as perhaps someone outside of New York, they see public spaces, they see things like the New York City subway, and they only hear the bad stuff. How do you think about public spaces as an agent for good in cities? And perhaps has it evolved?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think public spaces can have so many different meanings to people, right? And they can be used in so many different ways. And I think they for sure are a method for the good and for the public good. And I think one of my favorite examples is a lot of the work that was done in Barcelona in like the 90s. If I can just jump to across the Atlantic for a moment, and partly that's on my mind too because I was there with my students from the University of Pennsylvania this last fall, and the way that they leveraged the Olympics, which I think is still one of the kind of great examples of how cities leverage things like Olympics, which are not always necessarily so beneficial to the city at large afterwards, right? But there was a concerted effort to think about public space as really critical infrastructure and how you spread that across the city, right? And how that reinvigorates different communities and provides a certain sort of civic dignity to neighborhoods that might feel somewhat separated from the heart of the city and the kind of core of the city, right? A way to include through public realm, to create spaces that people are proud of, the spaces where they can go out and meet, right? I think that's really important.
Real quick, talk to me about that. What moves did Barcelona make that perhaps other cities might have gotten wrong? Like, how did they think of public spaces versus, say, other cities that maybe were less successful?
Well, I think part of it was this kind of targeting throughout all of the city, right? And thinking about it as a kind of distributed kind of resource for across the city. That's one thing. I think there was also a lot of work done in the old city where there was particular moments of thinking about carving out of that about a preservation, but not a preciousness about the historic city, where you could create these moments of opening where people could gather, right? And that creates some sense of glue and continuity connection. I think it's when public spaces become only the very primary kind of center city spaces, which can be great. There's a need for, let's say, a range of scales of spaces from the kind of Central Park, which is a kind of gathering for the whole city, or the Prospect Park, which is a gathering for Brooklyn, to the ones that are the very, very local neighborhoods. So they're and I think that's architecture and cities. I think thinking about nested scales of community, that it's not just one type, that it's not just the one big Instagrammable space, but it's also smaller community parks. And then it's also thinking about sidewalks at the very smallest scale, right? I know that there's in New York, with the new administration, I'm also excited about some of the new people that have been appointed to it, like Claire Mifflin, who's done a lot of work thinking about on the New York City sidewalks, right? And what that does to the sort of everyday public life and how that might sort of rethink that amount of public realm, the kind of everyday space. A lot of work that was done during the Bloomberg era that is still, we still feel the effects of it is still ongoing, of kind of really auditing the width of the right of way and how much is dedicated to cars versus not. And that's also amazing. The moments where all you do is clear some space and put out some chairs, and all of a sudden you've made a place for people to congregate, and a place where one doesn't have to pay, right? Where one can just stop there, bring their lunch, have a coffee, sit and talk with someone, or just read a book, or just watch life going by, right? I think it's creating inviting spaces that bring people onto the street where we see each other. I think I have to believe has kind of immeasurable impact over time, because it just creates this visibility and a rubbing shoulders with others.
So in addition to being a practitioner, you teach the history of modern architecture, and you talked about certain lineage, even from your father in the 60s, period
Yeah.
of kind of quietness to today. Is there a modernist idea that has aged well that we're still talking about today?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's so many things that sort of come in and out and return and have relationships, right? I think there's always this, when I talk with my students about architecture, I talk about these kind of pendulum swings, that you can kind of see through styles of or isms within modernism, right? That go from more expressive to more sort of rationalized, to more urbanistic, to more object oriented, etc. And I think that in some ways, I think we live in a time now where things are quite pluralistic. And I think that's in some ways good, that there is maybe not such a dominant style per se, but maybe there are other more performative kinds of forces that create a commonality around sustainability, around social engagement, etc. Right around, I think in the name of the book, but there's a lot of modern architecture history, the way it's taught, and that's to me what makes it so interesting. Is that I feel like I have to constantly rethink about how it's framed and how I talk about it, because I think it can't be said in the same sort of heroic singular narrative that it might have been told when I was first in school, right? Because there's so
Right.
many other lenses through which I think we need to see it, thinking about what is the kind of environmental impact of architecture across that time is another lens to think about it, right? To think about colonial kind of relationships across modern architecture, right? To expand the view of what modern means, right? And is that a very particular cultural lens, or should we be thinking about, where does the split between modern and contemporary happen, and how many different threads are there throughout that? So I think there's much to be rethought there, but I feel like it's more in the performative realm of what architecture can do, and how style fits into that to do those things, right? I think
Mm.
performative can range to still includes aesthetics, right? I don't think it's a purely rational thing, but it somehow moves you away from a dogmatic approach.
You're, from those front lines, and I appreciate that metaphor that you used about kind of lenses. What are young folks in school right now? What are the lenses that they're grappling with right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is and I've spoken with other, other professors and have heard the same thing over and over, or even just in the profession, younger architects. I think that when I finished school, a lot of architects, their goal will be, to do this beautiful house, right? This nice little project that I can kind of control everything and kind of realize, and that could be still very interesting. But I think there's a real push around what is the impact that I can make. I think younger architects coming out of school really feel the pressure and the weight of all of the kind of things that have happened, the kind of reality of the world that they live in and the future that they're seeing. And how can I make impact within that? And I think that is so much more front and center. And I
Mm.
think the people that we have coming to our firm are very much about how can we push the boundaries of sustainability, right? How can we think about social inclusion and open up how we think about architecture and urban design? And I think that's just so much more front and center. Like, how can I make what I do in this profession matter the most?
Yeah.
And I think that's fantastic. And that's so amazing and inspiring for me to see and to hear from my students. The architecture history classes that I have taught were at New York City College of Technology, which is the CUNY campus here in downtown Brooklyn. And we've also done these pre-internship programs with them in the office that were organized by Sanjeev Veda, who's the chair there, who's an old friend and I think has done great things there. We present our work to them, and they're a tough crowd. They have so many questions around like, what is the real impact there, and they make you kind of struggle then with the intents of what you're trying to do, the realities of the market and our clients and what we can do with it. And I think they just always remind us of our kind of core missions and keep us kind of pushing
Right.
on what we can do and what impact we can make.
Zoom me in. Is there, whether it's a kind of either a large kind of academic project you've taken on, or even as a practitioner, what was a project that helped you kind of understand or even change your worldview? Is there a particular project that you've maybe lost sleep over that now kind of is informing how you are viewing things?
Other project that I think for I mean, I think there's things that I
Probably like asking you like who's your favorite child kind of thing. Probably.
no, yeah. No, that's all right. Yeah, I was gonna say. I mean, and then as a parent, I will say I love them all.
Right.
There's something I can glean from all of them, but like I think across my career there were several different projects that were, I think, really meaningful to me. Before Henning Larsen, I spent 14 years or so working with Grimshaw, and one of the projects that I worked on when I started there was the Fulton Street Transit Center in Lower Manhattan. That's always close to my heart, also because I kind of started early on, and it was a project that stopped and started and taught me a lot about the kind of political realities and financing of making public projects work and how long they can take. It had kind of gone on hold for 3 years and wasn't sure if it'd come back, came back under Obama infrastructure money, and then seeing it built. And I think there was something about a clarity about diagram about how it connects to the public and how it creates a moment in the center oculus where daylight comes in, some connection to the outside world, something that creates a moment of pause, right, in your day to day that I think can bring, I think is I always loved, as Nick Grimshaw always said, that for Grimshaw, the architecture should have a sense of purpose, but should also bring some sort of joy, right? And that's something I carry with me, is this idea of joy, that there are so many things we need projects to do functionally, so many things we want them to do performatively in terms of sustainability, in terms of social inclusion, connection to public realm, on and on and on, to make a beautiful building. But where are the moments where we create joy? Where we create something that makes people pause for a moment, that makes them feel well, right? That connects them and stops that moment in the day. I think that's a really important thing to do. So that's a project, one project, anyways, that comes to mind.
Yeah, yeah. I have to bet from the time, again, maybe from those early Grimshaw days to today, the tools in which you're thinking about space and design has probably changed quite a bit. I brought this up on a few episodes here, where one of my favorite quotes is about Picasso. It's like, when you talk to art critics, you're talking about meaning and philosophy. When you talk to other artists, you're talking about where to find the cheapest paint. I think in a time when, design tooling and software and everything is kind of
Yep,
changing, we're using 3D modeling now.
yep,
Like, what tools are you using in your
yep,
day to day? Like, you wake up, you have to speak with your team, you have to design. Like, what are you
yep.
using these days?
Yeah. It's a good question. Yeah. So I mean, because I started drawing by hand, right, and then I was on AutoCAD 14, and then MicroStation, and so on. And of course, we use a host of different tools. From kind of 3D modeling with Rhino to BIM to kind of do our documentation as a kind of core, right,
Mm,
of what we do. But the tools, there's it's never. I don't think old ones necessarily go away. They just kind of transform a bit. I mean, we still do it. Henning Larsen, a lot of hand sketching, right? Sometimes it's on an iPad and it's on Miro, but it's sketching, it's drawing, and it's really, and now we also use AI. We're really doing a lot of conversation around what's the best way to use AI, and how do we use it in ways that helps us. The idea about sketching is this kind of this quick and immediate and gestural idea where you can get something across in a kind of efficient manner, but also an evocative manner, a way that people understand quickly, but they also don't get misled that this is somehow fully baked, right? That you can bring people into a process. And so now we're really thinking about how can we use AI across the range of a project, from those very beginning ideas that maybe help us do things, but do it in a way that it still feels like this is taken as an idea. This is taken as a concept, as something for us to create dialogue, right? To
mm.
prompt dialogue between us and our clients, us and our stakeholders, us and our consultants and colleagues, that doesn't go off into tangents that are beyond where we are in the project, right? But then helps us move towards more and more precision as we go along. I mean, well, let's say there's different kinds of precision, right? There's conceptual precision, and then there's kind of documentation precision, right? So
Wow.
it's different types of precision across it, depending on where we want to be, but how we are always intentional about it. I think beyond that, for us at Henning Larsen, we also try to create new tools for ourselves and think about how we work. We have a really robust kind of sustainability innovation group in Copenhagen that was built up largely by one of our kind of partners, principals Jakob Stroman Andersen, who came to us originally through this Danish industrial PhD program, which I think is an amazing thing that they do. I think it happens in other places, but they do it there, where they help sponsor the PhD studies in exchange for integration into Danish industry, right? So he came, worked with us, stayed, has developed this whole group that now develops tools for us, that helps us, and that ranges from doing microclimate studies that help us think about, from a singular building to a whole district, about how they're interacting in terms of daylight and wind and solar comfort across the year, so we can make, again, it's not just about the building, but how the building can make the outside active, right? How it can make it more comfortable longer into the fall and earlier into the spring. Also, we've developed tools for looking at high level thinking about embodied carbon at an urban district scale. So before we're at a point where we have enough nuance to be really doing full life cycle analysis and other things like that, how can we've developed a tool where we can take our kind of massing model, put it in, add in some assumptions around structural systems and envelope and whatnot, and begin to think about high level balancing of embodied carbon and operational carbon at an urban scale. how many of these, if we keep this building, if this is mass timber versus steel versus we tear down and build something new in mass timber, where do we kind of sit? Paving versus vegetated cover, right? So that's a tool that we use. I think we also have to think beyond tools that just help us. What are the key consultants we need? We have an anthropologist on staff in Copenhagen who worked with us to develop a research project around comfort of teenage girls in public space, and how do we design public spaces that are inclusive in that way, that different populations and different genders that may be looking for different things to feel comfortable and want to engage in public realm. On and on, right? Tools that we've developed a course around by Martha Lewis in our Copenhagen office called Unboxing Carbon, which has then been a way for us to kind of teach all of us, kind of have some high level rules of thumb about ranges of embodied carbon in different materials as we make choices, that we sort of have all of this along with all of the kind of environmental product declarations and the more detailed things, but help us. Again, I think it's tools that are tailored for where you are in a process.
Yeah. Greg, you present well, and I think it's not surprising. I think when your responsibility is to design for the public, it forces you to kind of grapple with a bunch more stakeholders that perhaps maybe the private industry doesn't. As a young architect, maybe someone who's in school, maybe a quick anecdote about myself. When I was in architecture school, I think I thoroughly underestimated the importance of really thinking through how do you kind of speak about the project that you just spent last weeks and all-nighters working towards. And there's often a rush at the very end to print and get everything ready, you pin up on the wall, and then all of a sudden you realize, oh, now I have to talk about it. Thoroughly underestimated the importance of this as a young designer.
And you may not have slept so well the night before either.
Well, the irony is that, right, after kind of an all-nighter, now you're with this brain fog, you now have to kind of think about how to present this kind of 4 weeks of work. In your experience working on public projects, any advice that you'd give, say, a young designer as they think about how to present work, right, to a public, say, sector, how to think about what matters? And any advice for someone interested in going into this line of work?
Yeah. That's a question close to my heart, because I do think communication is so essential in design, and communication can happen in many ways. But I think being able to present and talk about projects, because it's really in a lot of ways storytelling also, right? Storytelling and engagement, right? And dialogue. And I think there's a few things I would say, for me, I've also realized over time, when I was a kid, I did a lot of community theater, and I think that was a way for me something that I never thought would relate to what I do as an architect, but I still feel like gave me some real skill in just putting myself out there and being able to present, to kind of, because some of it sometimes is turning on a switch to be able to really project, to look people in the eye, to get engaged with them. But it also, I think the most important thing, I think when you're a young architect, you can get really nervous about presentations, and that's completely natural, right? We all get nervous when we need to get in front of people. But I think it's really important that you kind of relax and realize that what you want to do is engage them and make them feel like they're in a conversation with you, that they're in a dialogue, and that you're not just talking at them, but you're talking with them. And that you make room to say, it's okay that I might have stumbled on that word, or I may want to rephrase that or re-say that. And I think that also adds a level of humanity in how you talk with people that I think people will respond to, that they will understand, and that in some ways will kind of ease the room in some ways. So I think there's a on the one hand a kind of need to kind of to sort of try to kind of relax a little bit and bring down the kind of level that it's not such super high stakes, the presentation. And I think to do that, the important thing is maybe not scripting the whole thing, right? And I have students who present in my studio sometimes, so they've got everything written out, right? On their phone, and they're reading off of it. And I can understand, they're under a lot of pressure, and that gives them something to rely on. But I'm a big proponent of taking that. You may write that sometimes, but then take that and distill from it the 4 or 5 key things that might be a single word that you need to hit, right?
Right.
And if you use that and use those words to guide you, maybe you have those words on your slide, right? So those are cues for you. Then you can improvise a little bit. It makes room and space for a little bit of storytelling and engagement and humanity, because when you are just going through a script, people will glaze over. And all of a sudden they say, this is live. This person is really saying this on the moment, and they're speaking to us. They will wake up and they will listen, right? And I think that's important.
That's huge. That's huge. Greg, this has been super fun. And I trust that for listeners listening in, this has been pure gold here. For folks that want to follow you, follow your work, follow you as a professional, where do they go to? How do they follow along with your journey?
Well, I mean, I think you can follow me on LinkedIn. You can follow Henning Larsen on all kinds of social media. Check out our website. I think, as well as if you're in New York City, come to the AIA. I'm there often. I'm a co-chair of the Global Dialogues Committee, which we hosted that event this last Monday. I love to engage with dialogue with anybody that wants to talk or has ideas about another event.
Exactly.
Would be happy to hear it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jose. It's been a real pleasure.